Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood as a root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze. Strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here's a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here's a strange and bitter cry.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Dr. Danelle Goolsby, and I will have a brief discussion with you all about addressing racial inequality and tackling implicit biases. With the recent events that are happening in today's society, I felt that it was necessary for me to use my platform to address these issues and to tackle these issues, and to also really focus in on our administrators, our teachers, our district reps to make changes in their curriculums, and then to have the conversations with parents so that they can have these meaningful conversations with their children as they are our. Again, thank you so much for joining me. And please feel free to ask any questions in the chat. I have one of my amazing interns, Delaney, here with me, and she will be able to support in answering those questions. So today's objective is to support individuals in recognizing their implicit biases so that they can have meaningful conversations with others about equity, social justice, and racial inequality. So the rules of engagement. This is a safe place. Participate and be reflective. And what's learned here must leave here. So we'll start with our first reflection opportunity. I ask that you please be honest in answering at least one of the questions anonymously. So I'm going to go to there's something called a Padlet. If you look inside of the chat, You will have the link to the Padlet. Please go there and answer one of the first 2 questions. As you'll see, there are many, many questions, but if you can, just ask the first 2, answer the first 2. So one of the questions, what are your thoughts and feelings about today's current events around police brutality? And another one of the questions, what are some ways you've thought to address the current events with your staff, students, or children? Those are the only 2 that. And I'll ask that everyone please mute your mic. I'll give you all about 60 seconds. The way that you respond is there a comment box here. You can click on the comment box and begin to type in. Again, remember that this opportunity that we're having here is for you to be very reflective. It is not mandatory that you make a comment, but just listen to the questions, read them over, and think about these questions and how you would answer them. So as we begin to think about those questions, let's go through a very, very brief history lesson. And work with me because I want to set this up correctly for you all. Okay, so we're going to start back to the 1500s, where the beginning of slavery for Blacks. So work with me because there's a purpose as to why I'm doing this, because we need to set this up in a timeline so that you understand where we are today. So in the early 1500s, the Spanish and the Portuguese settlers, they bring slaves from Africa to the Americas. And then in the middle 1500s to the 1800s, there was something called the triangular trade. This is where the Americas, or the New World, they gave sugar, tobacco, and cotton to Europe. Then Europe shipped finished goods such as textiles to Africa. And then Africa would ship slaves to America. And so you kind of see this model here. It's a very, very simple model. There's others that show more of this trade, but this simple model shows how the trading went in a triangular motion. So now if we move to 1641, this is where slavery really began in the Americas. So in 1641, slavery was legalized. And then in 1662, there was a hereditary slavery that made children born to enslaved mothers slaves for life. And then in 1691, the state of Virginia created the manumission law, making it financially risky to free any slaves. Moving to 1694, the cultivation of rice increased the need and demand for slaves in the South. And this is due to the agriculture, the climate. So that's why there was a lot of slavery in the South. In 1790, the first consensus stated that Black slaves outnumbered the European slaves owners in the South. Then from the 1700s to the 1800s, there were many revolts and rebellions. There was the Great Awakening, where Blacks converted to Christianity. Moving to 1804, this was the start of the Underground Railroad, with this becoming its official name in 1831. From 1857 to 1868, the Dred Scott decision was upheld in the Supreme Court, and it denied citizenship to all slaves, ex-slaves, and descendants of slaves. and it denied Congress the right to prohibit slavery in the territories. Then in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected into office, and between 1861 and 1865, there was a Civil War, which was a war between the North and Southern states over slavery. Okay. Then from 1863 to 1865, there was the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. So in 1863, President Lincoln, he declared that all slaves held in the Confederate territory are free. However, the Emancipation Proclamation, it didn't end slavery. So according to National Archives, it applied only to states that had seceded from the Union, leaving slavery untouched, and border states. So then in 1865, slavery was abolished. And then according to the Constitution, the 13th Amendment, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Again, stay with me. There's a purpose as to why we're going over a history lesson on slavery. And then in 1865, this is why we celebrate Juneteenth. On June 19th, 1865, Union soldiers, they landed in Texas with news that the wars had ended and that the enslaved were now free. What made this so remarkable was that, or I should say significant, is that this day was 2.5 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. So there's 2.5 years between signing this Emancipation Proclamation and then when the state of Texas found out that the slaves were free. Now we're moving on to the 1900s. We're free, but still enslaved. W.E.B. Du Bois, he wrote, "The slaves went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery." What did that mean? So plantation work had many economical gains for the agriculture in the South, which made the South the most powerful source in the cotton market. However, because of the Civil War and the ending of slavery, it negatively impacted the economy. Shortly after the end of slavery, though, white leaders found a solution to helping the agriculture economy in the South by exploiting the provisions of the 13th Amendment and allowing slavery and involuntary servitude to continue as a punishment for crime. So now we're talking about incarceration. And most Blacks were convicted of not being employed. So let's think about this. Slavery just ended. They weren't considered as citizens. And then they couldn't get jobs. And the consequence for not being able to find work, you were punished, convicted of a crime, and sent back to slavery. Take a moment to think about that. Then we move to the 1948s during the Civil Rights Movement. So this was a movement that was organized in an effort to end racial discrimination and gain equal rights under the law. So not just regular laws, we wanted equal rights, wanted to be equal to others. It began in the late 1940s, it ended in the late 1960s. It was led by people like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, the Little Rock Nine, Rosa Parks, and many others. The Civil Rights Movement began to really pick up after the brutal murder of a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till. So I'm hoping that you know, but I'll give a little brief synopsis. Emmett Till was with his mom in the northern states. He asked if he can go with his family down south. He went, he whistled at a white woman in a convenience store, and then the woman's family, husband and brother, went and found this young boy, killed him. He was found in the river. When his mom saw him, she could not recognize him. This was the first of many open caskets because Mamie Till wanted everyone to see what was done to her son. And because of this, the civil rights movement really, really picked up. And it started with Rosa Parks not getting off the bus, a lot of the boycotts, the marches on Washington and Selma, and many more. Now we're going from 1968 to present day. We're still fighting. Let's talk about in 1990, the wrongful conviction and incarceration of Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Antron McCray, Yusef Salam, and Corey Wise, who are also known as the Central Park Five. And then in 1991, there was the beating of Rodney King and killing of Latasha Harling, who was a 15-year-old who went into a convenience store in LA to get orange juice. And the clerk thought she was stealing. They began to fight, and the clerk pulls out a gun and shoots her in the head. When the investigators came, they found $2 in her hand, indicating that she had the money to pay for the juice. Racial profiling. This led to the 1992 LA riots. Then there's the police killings of Sean Bell, Oscar Grant, Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, who was outside in Staten Island and was racially profiled by police officers and started the I Can't Breathe. Tamir Rice, who was playing in the park with his friends. Walter Scott, Sandra Bland, who was stopped for a traffic light signal and then died while she was in jail. Philando Castro, who was shot in front of his son and girlfriend. Elijah McClain, who went to a convenience store and was walking home and was racially profiled and told them that he couldn't breathe. Atiana Jefferson, who was shot in her home while playing video games with her son. Breonna Taylor, who was sleeping and was shot by police officers due to no-knock warrants. George Floyd. Rayshard Brooks, who fell asleep at a Wendy's drive-thru. And there's so many more. Then there's the racial killings of Trayvon Martin, who was walking home. Ahmaud Arbery, who was jogging in a neighborhood. The Charleston church shooting, where 9 individuals lost their lives while they were worshiping due to gun violence. And then there's the laws such as the stop and frisk and the no-knock warrants. This leads to systemic racism. Let me show you a little video just to get more in-depth and insight to systemic racism.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire Black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny Black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, Black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the Black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
Did you know that in 1958, a Black man named Clinton King applied to the University of Mississippi and was admitted to the asylum? The judge ruled that only insanity could make a Black man think he could apply to the university. Please be reflective. 1958 was only 62 years ago. So we're thinking about slavery in the 1500s, and then we're thinking about 1958, where there was still systemic racism. And then we're moving into 2020, where we're still facing the same issues. So there's another reflection opportunity. Again, you are not mandated or required to comment on the Padlet, but I would like you to be very reflective. If you would like to comment, that works as well. So you'll be reflecting on the next two questions here. What is your definition of systemic racism? And were there any surprises, anything that challenged what you know or thought you knew? I'll give you about a minute to reflect on that or make comments. Okay, now that you had time to reflect, let's keep going. talk a little bit about systemic racism a little more. So it's a racial oppression across all major institutions in the US society structure. So according to Feigen in 2006, systemic racism is the racist ideology, attitudes, emotions, habits, actions, and institutions of whites in this society. So some examples that we already discussed, but I want to make sure that you all understand are racial profiling, the wealth gap, employment, incarceration, housing discrimination, drug arrests, and government surveillance. Systemic racism is also reflective of the post-traumatic slave syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy. Her work and research talks about PTSS, which is the post-traumatic slave syndrome. It's a theory that explains many of the adaptive survival behaviors in African-American communities throughout the United States. It's a condition that exists as a consequence of multi-generational oppression of Africans and their descendants resulting from centuries of slavery. So it's known as a form of slavery, which was predicted on the belief that African Americans were inherently or genetically inferior to whites. This was then followed by what we just talked about, systemic or institutionalized racism, which continues to perpetuate injury and inequality. So now let's talk about implicit bias. I'm going back to the Padlet. You don't have to comment, but I do want you to be reflective. What is implicit bias? How is implicit bias different from racism? And how does implicit bias lead to discrimination like racism? We haven't talked about it much, but these are the questions that I want you to think about as we go into the next few slides. Again, what is implicit bias? How is implicit bias different from racism? And how does implicit bias lead to discrimination like racism? So implicit bias can be defined as the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Implicit biases are pervasive, and they can challenge even the most well-intentioned individuals, resulting in actions and outcomes that do not necessarily align with explicit intentions. For example, many of the infractions students are disciplined for have a subjective component. So we're thinking about students in school. Most times, students they get consequences or they're reprimanded based on preconceived notions of something that teachers may have thought they've done, but not really understanding the child. In education, the real life implications of implicit biases can create invisible barriers to opportunity and achievement for some students. So here are some steps to having healthy conversations with others about racial inequality, social justice, and police brutality with resources. So my position where I work currently as I lead the equity team, and due to the current events, a lot of information was sent to me. So a lot of the resources that I'm going to talk to you about in the next few slides are resources from other organizations, and also combine some of the resources that I've found. But I just want to be clear that a lot of the resources I did not come up with myself. The first step is to start with yourself. Self-reflection is important in preparation for facilitating sensitive conversations. As educators, parents, staff developers, we have to process our own feelings and become aware of the way our own identities and experiences shape the perspectives we hold. So there's an article called Start With Yourself. It's on section, it's page 2 of Fostering Civil Discourse Guide. And then you can use these questions to help guide your reflection. So what emotions do the recent events surrounding the death of Mr. Floyd raise for you? What perspectives will you bring to your reflection on these events with your students or your children? What can you do to ensure that students or your children or your staff have a range of perspectives and that they're supported? As the story develops, with different things that's happening, especially the rioting. You can even talk about the looting or the recent killings. How will you continue to learn alongside your students and children and staff? Then you must create a space for reflection for others. So in the midst of traumatic and violent events, it can be beneficial to focus first on an emotional processing, addressing the heart before the head. Give yourself, your staff, your students, or your children space to reflect on emotional responses to the event. Let them know that their learning environment is a safe space. Begin with a brief contracting activity if you don't already have those norms. Invite your students or whoever you are engaging in this process, time to modify. Consider sharing a resource from trusted news sources so that they have background and knowledge. And then you can go deeper about the history of police violence toward Black Americans. You can use the New York Magazine. There's a lot of equal justice initiatives. There's an article called The Racist Roots of American Policing, from slave patrols to traffic stops. There's also, you can have students synthesize what they have learned from one or both of the resources. You can use a diagram to have students really begin to think about and compare and contrast events from the past to events from today, and then have them start thinking about what can be done to make change. This includes raising their voice. So concluding your discussion by inviting students or your children to step back and consider what's at stake in the aftermath of what's going on right now, including Mr. Floyd's death. Ask students to imagine that they have the chance to communicate directly to one or more key figures. What questions would they want to ask? What perspectives would they want to share? And if students or children would like to share reflections publicly, I think this is very important to get our children's voice heard. You can share with the New York Times, with the Learning Network. Here are more ways to address these issues. Find books that talk about differences, such as Don't Touch My Hair, The Day You Begin, Last Stop on Market Street, Stamped, Racism, Anti-Racism, and You, Hair Love, animated short film of Hair Love, the animated film of Last Stop on Market Street, newspaper articles, What Does It Mean to Respect Each Other, and utilize core values that you create with your staff, your children, your families, and all that you come in contact with. I think this is very important to utilize all of your resources. I come from a background of theatrics and of poetry, and I thought this poem by Langston Hughes was very important because in 1950s, Langston Hughes was doing the same things or feeling the same things that we felt today. He says, I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Langston Hughes said, tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. But for me and all those that I come in contact with, today I will be at the table when company comes. And nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. Why? Because I too am America. The world is standing with us. Will you?
Bless the light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, this light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. This light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Oh, this light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. This light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. This light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Oh, let it
Racism is a learned behavior passed down from generation to generation. We, as educators, can't control what is taught at home, but we can control what is taught in schools. Like Gandhi said, be the change you want to see, because the Black race still can't breathe. Let's take a moment. This is our last reflection piece. As we're listening, I want you to be very reflective.
Gonna make a change for once in my life. It's gonna feel real good. Gonna make a difference. Gonna make it right. As I turn up the collar on my favorite winter coat, this wind is blowing my mind. I see the kids in the street without enough to eat. Who am I to be blind, pretending not to see them eat? I saw us disregard a broken bottle top and a one-man soul. They follow each other on the window. They got nowhere to go. Otherwise, no one can know. I'm starting with the man in the mirror. I'm asking him to change his ways. And no message can amend any clearer. If you want to make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and then make a change. Pretending that I don't know. Oh, well, deep in the sky, somebody's broken heart and washed out tears. They follow the pattern of the window street. They got no place to be. That's why I'm starting with me. I'm starting with the man in the mirror. If you wanna make the world a better place, take a look at yourself and the mirror. I'm asking you to change your way. Wanna make the world.
Our final reflection. Cops aren't wearing uniforms to and from work right now because they're afraid someone might attack them or their families. Think about this. Can you imagine that? Living with a constant fear of being killed by a complete stranger because to them, you look like a threat. These are questions I want you to think about. What are your takeaways from today? How can you use your experiences as well as your learned knowledge to have these conversations with your staff, students, parents, and children? And then think about the supports that you need to prepare yourself to have discussions about racism and racial inequality, not just with staff, but everyone that you come in contact with. So what now? Our school districts, our schools, and different entities that are teaching children, institutions that are teaching children need to develop curriculums that address racial inequality, social justice, and equity. Be reflective of your own practices, your thoughts, stereotypes, and attitudes. Educate yourself and educate our children. Each one must teach one. Creatively help our youth. conquer education and success. Use your voice by voting. As we creatively help our youth conquer education and success, that means tapping into their gifts, what they're great at, and utilizing those skills to continue to educate them so that they can become successful and be the change that we want to see. Because our children are definitely our future. So we need to set up environments where they can attain all that they dream. They can become the police officers. They can become the legislators. Being a Black president is not far-fetched. It's been done before and it can be done again. If you see something, say something. There has been many times throughout this entire with the news and Mr. Floyd and a lot of things that are happening with the rioting, I have made the conscious decision that if I hear conversations that don't seem right, if I see something that don't seem right, and these people are in my vicinity and they're in my presence, I am going to say something because I want to know what the intentions are and I want to tug at the heart and find out if these people need to be educated. Research studies that are in the works, the perception of the Black man and police brutality, and the honest truth, why that career choice, a call for reflection. I think these two are very, very important because we need to figure out what we're going to do to stop racism, to stop racial inequality, and to create equitable opportunities for the Black community. For more information about social justice, implicit bias, and equity curriculum planning or professional learning opportunities, please contact us at info@choices.org, or you can contact me personally at dgoolsby@choices.org. Our phone number is 347-916-6535. If you need references for all of the information presented today, they will be available upon request. And although we are talking about racial inequality, we are also talking about creatively helping our youth conquer education and success. So I'd be remiss if I did not promote our Summer Dance Academy. Would you like to creatively help our youth conquer education and success? Featuring Miss Fatima Yane Simmons, who's also my sister and a partner of Choices. You can register or sponsor a child today. You can email us again at info@choices.org for more information. Our first virtual Summer Dance Academy is going to be so much fun. Fatima has expertise as she went to performing arts high school, and her undergrad is in theater and her dance, and she also has performed with Lizzo at the VMAs. She's been a Puma Fashion Week model, and she's done so much in it. She's a choreographer, and children just love her. So if you have more questions or concerns, please reach us there. I'll now open the conversation for any final thoughts if you have any.
Hi, Dr. Goolsby.
Hi.
How are you?
Great, thank you.
I thought your presentation was very relevant, very informative. My question is, what do you think can be done for, clearly the issue is not just Black men, but Black women are being brutalized too. So what can be done for, as a Black person, to protect yourself going out in these onto the road, in public, at home, at the store? What are some things that you think can be done?
So I personally, I feel like that's research that is in the work that need to really be done. But in my personal opinion, I feel like because the Black race, there's so many components to Blacks. So we have Black children, Black women, Black men. But I think as research has stated, that a lot of the brutality and a lot of the racial inequality, it's targeted toward our Black men. So that's why I started there, to find out what are their perceptions and what can be done and what do they think can be done to make changes. Again, if we go back through the presentation where we talked about the post-traumatic slave syndrome. So that's some of the behaviors that you see a lot of our Black people that we have based on our history, right? And so we're thinking about, as we're thinking about the post-traumatic slave syndrome, I think it's very important that we begin to have these conversations with each other and that we hold ourselves equal to others, because sometimes we feel that when we go out, we have to behave a certain way or we have to lower our voices. My biggest thing is thinking about our Black people who like to be outside. We like to communicate with each other. We like to have fun. We like to play basketball. We like to be loud in large groups. That doesn't mean that we're doing anything bad. And so we have to begin to educate each other, educate others that are in these political positions. Again, as I mentioned before, we have to be the change we want to see. So as we are teaching our children as they're growing up, help them, vote for them to be in positions of power so that they can help make the decisions. They can help hire others who have good character and mean well. I hope that was a start to your question, but this is a bigger issue that research needs to be done. And then we need to come together as a community, as a Black community. What I notice is that Black people, we're angry. And so sometimes we take our anger out on each other. And so we have to have a mind shift where we are not taking it out on each other, but we are really getting to the root and the heart of the issue so that we can progress as a society.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for asking. Are there any other questions that you all may have?
Dr. Goolsby?
Hi.
I didn't particularly have a question. I did want to piggyback on some of the things that you said. And I'm just thinking of a mom and a grandmom who lives in society, who works in society, who's raising African-American or Black children. And it has always been one of the big things for me. I raised daughters. I did not have to raise men until I had a grandson who I was helping to just really wrap my arms around and understanding society as a whole and the different inequalities and the injustices that are out. And I remember just teaching my daughters to remember who you are and whose you are. And you are who you are by the way you carry yourself. And as we continue to do that and stand up with knowledge and understanding, with a background of history like you taught on today, recognizing and understanding that our voices do matter, we can together win this battle. But we've got to stand as one. We have to continue to stand as one and remember that we are stronger together than we are apart.
Absolutely. Thank you for your reflection. Absolutely. I totally agree. Are there any other reflections or thoughts that you have before I end today's session? I do again want to thank you all so much for participating and being here with me as we begin the necessary work to definitely make change. And I just want to say that, change is not going to happen overnight because we've been dealing with trying to make changes for years and years and years, but getting at the root and becoming a part of the institutions and making changes. But the bigger part is don't be in the world, but not be conformed to the ways of the world. So as we get in these positions, don't change or lose focus as to why we're there. And I'll leave you with that last thought. Thank you so much and have an amazing rest of the day.